But thank you and welcome to Curator Conversations, a monthly series where we'll ask a local curator or arts organizer to pick an artist that they enjoy chatting with. You'll hear about their work, and it'll also give you a chance to learn more about the absolutely incredible arts community that we have here in the city. Tonight, I am thrilled that we have Cortney Lederer, who is an art consultant, curator, and educator with 20 years of experience managing an array of artistic programming for organizations and businesses. In 2014, she started CNL Projects to provide artists and organizations with a platform to creatively produce impactful art experiences. CNL's work is deeply centered on her unique collaborative approach to working with artists, clients, businesses, and organizations to advocate for the value of art and culture in daily lives. She is joined by Yasmin Spiro, who was born and grew up in Kingston, Jamaica, and currently lives and works here in Chicago. Spiro's work is multidisciplinary, and you'll be hearing a lot more of that tonight in their discussion, but it's primarily based in sculpture and immersive installations with video, drawing, and performance, exploring issues of cultural identity, socioeconomic issues within the framework of urban development and social politics, often through the lens of Caribbean culture. Spiro's work has been shown at galleries in the US and Caribbean, and she's also a founding member of Tart Women's Collective in New York, founded in 2004. And with that, I will hand it over to Cortney. I'll just remind you all that Yasmin will be sharing her screen through some of this, but we also have a chat function. So if you would like to drop any comments or questions to anyone in this group, be sure to do so. Thank you all again for joining.
Thank you, Adia. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm so pleased to be invited by 21C Hotel Museum to share the stage with Yasmin Spiro. I've been following Yasmin's work for some time, and it's really exciting to engage in a conversation with her this evening, specifically to talk about her work, thinking about how she came to understand her art and where she really sees it going into the future. I believe it's really in this moment that we're looking to artists as meaning makers and problem solvers. We are counting on their risk-taking, their experimentation and process through making, through building and reflecting to help us to understand this moment we find ourselves in and lead us into the future of change, growth, and healing. So with that, I want to dive straight into Yasmin's practice by asking some questions. And of course, we'll do a little improvisation as we go along. The foundation of your work, Yasmin, really emerges out of the context of growing up in Kingston, Jamaica, with a family of creatives, architects, artists, designers. Can you talk about the influence that has had in shaping your work?
Sure. And thank you also to 21C and Adia and to you, Cortney, of course, for inviting me to be a part of this today. I'm really excited to share this with you. Yeah, so I grew up mainly in Kingston, but sort of between Kingston and the north coast of the island, where my parents also have a small farm, peppermint farm. And even in Kingston, we lived slightly outside of the city in a sort of somewhat rural area in the hills. My father's an architect and urban planner. He is Israeli, and my mother is American. She is the child of Yugoslavian Croatian immigrants. She was born and grew up in Long Island in New York. And they met in New York, and in the late 60s, my father had, I guess, was a couple years out of graduate school. He moved to New York to study architecture and then did a master's in urban planning. And I think he studied urban planning in the 60s, and it was sort of the heyday of Buckminster Fuller and kind of these ideas of futuristic cities and city as organism. And he had a mentor in college that he worked with on his thesis, which was about how urban planning can impact socioeconomic change. And so he had really wanted to work in a developing country I think for him, the idea of like, kind of working through his sort of impulse to become an urban planner, I think it had a lot to do with his family moving to what was then Palestine and became Israel, and kind of leaving Europe, sort of fleeing the Holocaust and moving to Israel, and the idea of the creation of a new place or a new city or a new state or starting over. And so I think my father was really interested in working somewhere that was sort of emerging. And so he got this job in Jamaica and he was dating my mom at the time, and they went to Jamaica in the 60s thinking they would stay for like 6 months or a year, and then stayed and had my brother and had me and got married at some point in that process. The date always changes depending on, let me tell the story. And so, I grew up, with a lot of art and design around me, and they had a lot of kind of friends. They were part of this cultural group in Jamaica. And in the 60s and the 70s, Jamaica became independent in 1962. And so the 60s and the 70s in Jamaica were this real like heyday of Jamaican nationalism and kind of this forming of a new identity of what it meant to culturally be Jamaican, and kind of distancing themselves from colonialism and sort of this kind of hybridity of culture. And so I sort of grew up in this. And also my grandmother was wanted to be an artist, my Croatian grandmother, and she I guess grew up in a time when she wasn't allowed to be, really. And so she buried herself in every creative pursuit, which was often sewing. And so she's the first person who taught me how to sew, and had these like sewing rooms in our house where there was just tons of textile. And I think a lot of the textile work I make comes from her influence as well. But I think the sort of the physical and the cultural landscape of Jamaica is something that's like so embedded in my brain. Sometimes I make things in my studio and I don't really even realize until 6 months later that there's something like, there's something that I looked at over and over again, sort of visually as a kid growing up in Jamaica. And sometimes you see them, I have these pieces that I made that they start to look like zinc fences that you see all over Jamaica. So there's like all this like visual references. And I grew up also around a lot of craft artists, weavers, potters, wood carvers that my parents were friends with and were part of this sort of cultural community in Jamaica.
I wonder if too, we might be a really good time to pull up some of your, just to have your website and some of your images up so that we can kind of think about all these really interesting things that you're saying while we're thinking particularly about your grandmother and her hands and textiles, and seeing, I mean, we can see some of it behind you now, but to be able to look into that specifically, like some of these fiber-based works, and really kind of feel what it is you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And, I want to continue by saying, as I was thinking about this conversation, and what I love about your work is that you're not someone who could be easily boxed in the best possible way. Like, we can't describe your work in a sentence or two very simply. And I think that is actually a strength. But at the same time, I really feel like there is a language that's very recognizable in your work, despite the material that you're using. So whether it is even in fiber-based or ceramic or, some of the other materials that you're using, we really start to see this language that's coming through. I also want to mention that, your work, what I find to be so interesting is this sort of these push and pull between the hard and the soft in terms of the materiality, but also the dark and the light that we can even see in the image that you have here. And that your work, further speaking about this, kind of moves between this notion of craft, what you're talking about, that you were very much immersed in Jamaica, to industrial design and architecture and performance and the conceptual. And even I want to throw in there some elements of fashion too, as we start to build down into some of the bodily works. I just want you to talk about the materiality of your work. And how the materiality of your work helps us to sort of understand the meaning making that you're doing. So whether you want to talk about process and how you kind of move through these materials, or I'll let you kind of enter in any way here.
Yeah, I try not to ramble because this is one of those questions that
I
has
know.
a
I know
long
when I ask
answer.
you, I asked you a lot of things. I have a bad habit of asking 3 questions at once.
No,
So
it is
we'll
good.
see how it goes.
Yeah. You know, I grew up just sort of making things all the time. I really liked working with my hands, and I was always sort of helping my dad on construction sites. I spent a lot of time on construction sites, like after school, I'd get dragged to a construction site, but also like on our farm, gardening and helping my dad with the agriculture and building. You know, I was a big fort builder. I think you can maybe see it in my work. But I really, you know, I really love material exploration. And I think that I often, you know, there is a lot of different kind of materials in my work. And I think I go through phases with things. I sort of obsess about a material or a grouping of material for a while. And then I hold on to some of them and then I move on and I bring them back. And I have a tendency to sort of repurpose older work also. And I just really love textiles, and like this piece on the screen now is a piece I did. I made the kind of the modular pieces at the Kohler residency in 2018, 2019. Bobby, who's on the Zoom, was my co-resident, my cohort. And it was a really wonderful experience. And so for me, I had started casting in plaster and hydrocal, creating these pieces that were these pleated tiles that referenced feminine gestures in architecture. And I would create multiples of them. And I had made these sorts of large installations using those tiles. And I had used architectural samples to make the molds, and I was using synthetic molds. And so when I applied to the residency, I thought about sort of expanding this practice. And I had some familiarity with ceramics. As a kid, one of my mother's friends she still is an incredible ceramicist in Jamaica, Norma Herrick. And when I was like 12, I worked as an assistant. It's funny to think that I worked at 12, but I worked as an assistant for like a day camp she did for like really little kids, like rolling out clay and like, you know, making, you know, fishes, and then they'd stamp on them. And she was someone that I was close to as a kid, and she also taught at the School of Art in Jamaica. And I was around a lot of sorts of pottery, and I did some ceramics in high school, but the residency at Kohler was an amazing experience to kind of really dive into this exploration of a material, and an incredible learning experience. It was very generous. We had to learn this process of making these rigid molds in plaster, and this whole process of working within the factory and casting and glazing using these industrial glaze booths. And so this was a continuation of those pieces. And so while I was there, I started, like, when it comes to color, it was sort of something that I grappled with. I did a lot of experimentation, and I was thinking about, because so often I use the inherent color of a material. So in this instance, I was thinking about the lake. I spend a lot of time at the lake in Chicago, and I probably have like thousands of videos of moving water on the lake. This is another series I'm working on in my head for another time. But this piece is sort of, I realized after making it that there's often a horizon line in many of my works. And I think that has a lot to do with growing up on an island, spending a lot of time on the water. And so these pieces are kind of different pigmentations of glazes. And so it was also based on ideas of modular housing. And I was just thinking about housing and in general, and sorts of community building. The show itself was sort of conceptually based on this book by Marge Piercy called The Edge of Time. That's like a feminist dystopian novel, where there's like a woman at the center of this book who kind of fantasizes. It's either a fantasy or it's a reality. You don't really know, of this sort of alternative reality where women rule society. Anyway, that's the side ramble. But for many of these, the works are about exploring a material. And for me in the studio, you know, I start with research, and I start with sort of building an idea. And I kind of make an archive, and then I sort of let it go and explore the material through process in the studio. Sometimes I set up kind of a structure or a system for myself to use in making them, and kind of rebel against my own structure and try something new as I'm working through them. So these two pieces here are part of my safety series, and they're two domes that you can actually go up and under. One has a sound element that is a recording of sound from my parents' farm in Jamaica. So it's a kind of a loop of crows, crickets, the sound of these trucks going up the hill to a limestone quarry nearby, and then the sound of my feet on the ground and on the farm. And then the other one has these two hanging orbs. One contains peppermint oil, and one has pimento oil in it, and they're both scents from the farm. And I was just thinking with these about how you kind of isolate sensory experiences and how they connect you to a place. So I'm often like missing home, and I call my mother and I'll hear the crows, and it's this funny thing where I'm like really connected to that space. And I'm thinking about sort of neuroaesthetics and how you locate your sense of who you are through those things. And so this was sort of a way of isolating them. In sort of COVID time, I don't know if I could show these and have people go up and under. It's interesting when I showed them, people would go in together and sort of I'd hear them giggling and then like leave. But yeah, and then so this is another piece I made as part of my safety series. That's a hanging bridge called Trustfall, and this was in a show at the National Gallery in Jamaica that was kind of about fashion in a way. It was about it was called Beyond Fashion, and it was about works that reference textile or fashion, but in a broader sense.
Can I ask you too, in looking at these works, because they do have such this sort of abstract quality, and yes, there is scent and meaning and other sound and other experiences that one gets from being in conversation or being in the presence of them. How much, because I guess because your work is so deeply tied to so many other cultural references or particular spaces or experiences, how do you work to kind of bridge that experience for the audience to be able to understand, all the meanings, I guess, that these works have, and how important is that to you?
It's a question I ask myself all the time. I think that some of it can be communicated, but I also do think there's something about artwork that's just felt, that's a visceral thing. You did a talk last night, Cortney, and I think Corey said something interesting, and I may be butchering like exactly what he said, but he said sometimes you don't make art for the audience, sometimes you make art in your own space, in your own head. And I think I do think about the audience, but I also think about how people just react to things viscerally. And it's interesting. So this particular piece, I hung it in, it was installed in the show in Jamaica. And as part of the programming, there was a theater and dance group called Nexus that walked through the gallery. And I was fortunate to be there when they did it in like December of 2018. And they would stop at each piece. It was about 30 singers and dancers, and they would talk about the piece, and then they would perform a song that they felt was inspired by the piece.
Wow.
And so they didn't know I was there. And so the lead of the group talked about how, about sort of like the fragility of life. And then he also referenced the fact that, it also reminded him of sort of the more rural parts of Jamaica where there still are hanging bridges. And he talked about like a kind of community trust and like our sense of like where we are in Jamaica in terms of like progress and culture. And then they sang Bridge Over Troubled Waters, and like, it was nothing that I told them. So I didn't give them that information. I was very emotional. I think they were probably like, why is she crying?
I do. But that's exactly what you're talking about, is that's a perfect case of that, I guess, a successful work that is able to achieve that, that is able to move people to think about something in particular, to move people to feel something. And clearly that's what this work has done.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes there's a more kind of literal one-to-one and thinking of like the, you know, the experience of the audience, like with the hanging pods here, here, and here. Like, I knew that the sounds would evoke different things for different people, like their own memories. So the smell, like for some, the peppermint may evoke something, you know, familiar, or the sound of the crickets or the crows, depending on where they're from or their own life experience. And other times, I think that connection is maybe, I don't know, a little more abstract, I guess.
Exactly. No, I hear you and I feel you with that. I think, you know, I wanted to speak to this too, in thinking about all the different elements that your work entails, that I just kind of went over and that you introduced us to too, because I feel like your work really deals, I mean, you talk about this, but your work deals with borders and boundaries. Particularly as it applies to both our body, our land, and I also want to say to our skin in like an even deeper context. And then, you know, in kind of looking, which I'm glad you have this up right now, you have these series of works and they have these titles that are safety, edges, mapping, tracking, suspended, and all applied to me this sense of, I couldn't quite find the word. It's like an urgency, or it evokes a sense of, I don't know if there's maybe a sense of fear in some of these words potentially for me. And so I couldn't help but think about these because we are in this moment.
Right.
And everyone says it's a moment. I don't know how else to describe it, but we have these pandemics, these multiple pandemics, and these tensions that we're living through. So while some of these works were made at a very particular time, I want to understand a little bit about that, of what you were thinking about. And I want to understand how we may think about these things, how the work takes on new meaning today.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting how you make work that's kind of threaded, like a certain idea is threaded through it, and then the time changes and they're sort of recontextualized, or you see different things in your own work almost. So for this particular series called Safety Series, I started it, I think in 2016, right after the election. I had been gifted by a friend I work in the design world, and she was leaving Chicago to move to Detroit. And she had gifted me these like bolts and bolts of this really beautiful, like very generously, this beautiful wool felt. And I started experimenting with hanging the felt, and I had made other felt pieces before. So this is a smaller piece that I had made like a year or two before that. And I always loved felt. I worked with burlap for a long time, and I had started slowly working with felt. And I was a printmaker, and you know, you use felt in the printing presses, and felt is also kind of this like, amazing material because it doesn't have warp and weft. So it's a fabric, it's a textile that's made from the compression of fibers. And it has sort of this animal quality, you know, and also thinking of artists like Joseph Beuys and Robert Morris that you predominantly use felt, but felt isn't the only thing used. But in this case, I had this generous amount, and I started building this piece, and I was thinking of like kind of housing systems, but also like cities and how people feel safe within a physical space. And so the first piece that I made was this piece called Safety Wall. That is like long panels sewn together and this kind of like almost like architectural weaving. It's not actually weaving, and making this piece. And then I moved on to this piece that sort of was those pleated tiles I was referencing before. And then this felt kind of addition that mimics it. So that thing you were talking about earlier about the contrast of hard and soft, and the soft things almost looking hard. And I think that at the time I was also thinking about myself as an immigrant and feelings of lack of safety. I think that, you know, it was also the sort of that period where the news was trotting out all those images of like the wall samples for the border wall, and then testing different like border wall samples, and just like people sort of fetishizing them as like design objects, but there's such a darkness behind that idea. And you know, for me growing up in Jamaica, I felt like I had the privilege of I could travel because my mother was American. So I was born with an American passport. But for so many people in Jamaica, they couldn't travel. Like they needed a visa to get out, and like traveling was complicated. And as a kid, my parents, my mom mostly, but helped a lot of people get visas to travel through her like American connections. And I guess I was also, you know, thinking about sort of the hierarchy of access with borders, and that kind of access still being so tied to colonialism and who's allowed to cross a border, and why a certain passport is valued over another passport, and the ability to move within space. And those are like, you know, our constructs, you know, and that we never question, or we do question, obviously we question them all the time, but they're so tied to keeping a certain kind of structure in place. And within that, there's also a lot of racism, because it tends to be, you know, very sort of constructed around, like for Jamaica, for instance, or Caribbean islands, you know, that were once colonies, and those folks, you know, can't travel, there's not access. And the same thing for like parts of the Middle East, and that, thinking about what that has to do with the color of people's skin, and like that kind of limit of access. And I guess, you know, from on a personal, like, so it's sort of micro and macro at the same time. And so those are the things I'm thinking about. But then I, you know, I go into the studio and I explore the material, and, you know, weave the ideas into the work, so to speak.
Quite literally.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting too, this notion of safety and this notion of a wall, and yet this material, while it's heavy, I'm imagining, I don't know how heavy it is in this larger image, but I mean, it's almost like a giant blanket, right? So it's like on the one hand, it can totally, you know, you could be wrapped up in it. And on the other hand, it's a wall, it will never protect you, right? Because it's not hard, it's soft, right? Or it's not an actual barrier. So I mean, it has me thinking about a lot of those things.
Yeah, these other pieces, I think, these are called sensitive fences, but they're made with felt and stained wood. And they sort of start to look like oceans and rafts and fences. And, you know, sensitive fences, also thinking about like kind of the kind of precarious nature of borders and belonging.
Absolutely. Yeah, they're really, I mean, they're quite beautiful. Your technique is really beautiful as well. I wanted to ask you, you know, you have an exhibition currently up at Heaven Gallery. I don't know if you could share how much longer it will be up for. Can you tell us about that particular, your newest body of work?
Yeah, so it's called Autoethnography, and it's a two-person show with Haram Lee, and it's curated by Adina Jade Costin, who is at SAIC. And it's thinking about, Haram is Korean, and it does a lot of work that thinks about her own background and then her connection to Chicago and sorts of Chicago spaces. And she's very engaged in ideas of sorts of social justice. And so for this show, we met every other week for many months, probably like 6 months leading up to show, talking about sorts of commonalities in our work. And the kind of the main piece that I put in the show is this piece here called Zugaloom. That's about, right, in the way it's hung here, it's about 5 feet high, but it's about 15 feet across. And it's 900 overlapping squares. It's this kind of a long, like huge rug piece that's then hung as this like collapsible structure. And I was looking at vernacular architecture, and I use a lot of architectural references in my work, and this particular piece was influenced by, and I should say this is something I worked on for a really long time during the lockdown, and it was this weird meditative, like I worked on the same thing over and over again, and it was like something I had to lose myself in to like get through this, the last
Talk
year.
a little bit, just so, because what we're looking at, and because we're not seeing it in person, you said there's 900 squares, yes?
Yeah, so each of these, so it's like 38 or 40, I think, strips. It's like, overlapping, and then each little square is I use sort of fabric adhesive, and it's all ironed together and like glued and sewn. And I actually used my kid as like a studio assistant for many months last year because I couldn't bring anyone else to my studio, and she like reluctantly came and helped me.
Wow.
But yeah, so it was like I kind of needed to set out a sort of big project for myself to get through this time. And it references these architectural structures in Turkey called harans, and it's this interesting space. They've been making them for like thousands of years, and it's a space that was a trading outpost. But geographically, it's been Syria, it's been Iraq, and so its sort of identity has changed. And so when I was looking at these structures, I became really interested in the place itself as well, and the idea that it was a Mesopotamian city. And so Zugalum there was an Assyrian queen named Zugalum that ruled Haran. So that's where the name of the piece came from. And so there are these big vernacular architectural structures that were built as like almost like large storehouses for food and to keep things cold. So they were stacked bricks that had mud on the outside, and they still make them today. So they look exactly the same, and they build them in long rows. So they look like these big beehives. And so this was sort of inspired by that piece. And then, it was sort of a combination of this piece as kind of the central piece. And then I also, in that show, are these pieces, which are called Matapoiset, and the name comes from the show I did last year at Flux. It's called Edge of Time, from the Marge Piercy book. But the ceramic pieces I made at Kohler, and these works, I had made these modular ceramic pieces, and it took me a long time kind of working through in my studio. I knew I wanted them to be textile and ceramic, but figuring out what the extension of the pieces were, I kind of envisioned them as these buildings within the city. So I have about 30 of them, like another one here. And just thinking through, each of them felt like they became these people or these organisms, and I started thinking of like they felt like an extension of the body, or they look like folds in the skin. The color, there are all these like different shades of pink, and I had made all these different pink pigments and glazes at Kohler, so that none of them were the same. And they were actually like a little, sometimes work is easy, it just comes out. These were a little bit of a struggle, but like it was one of those things where when they were finished, I felt so sure of them. It was really satisfying, the way the felt kind of, and I found this kind of synthetic felt that because it has a little bit of plastic in it, it really holds the form well. And so these kind of like heavy pleats that look like kind of hard edges, or like your elbow, or, the crease of a knee. And they really feel like body and city at the same time.
That's true. You can really sense that. I also want to ask if you're comfortable is to talk, if you'd be willing to share like how you mentioned this struggle and then being so sure. Can you talk about like what that is like as an artist, to kind of, maybe not in detail about the struggle part if that's too personal, but how do you know, like how do you work through the struggle to get to that point where it just makes sense?
Well, it's so funny because like I was thinking about this the other day. I was also during the talk that you did last night with the group. Like sometimes, like it's kind of like the unromantic, unsexy thing to talk about. That like making art is sometimes is really hard. It's like it's a lot of work. It's a hustle, and like juggling like work life, family, like and then in your studio also. It's not. I mean, maybe for some people, they just go in and they just whip it out. But, there are times when you feel like you're in the flow, and there are other times when, I have these days where I go in and like, I'm using a tool and I cut all the fabric the wrong way, and then I waste material and I'm frustrated, and I go home and like, or I got this new tool. I was obsessed with these rotary scissors that you plug in and they cut like through really thick fabric, and it's really nerdy, but like, and then I kept making mistakes with them. And so, it was also about like how to manipulate materials. And some of it is, there's a lot of failure in that. You try things, you build things, they don't work, you throw them away, or you think like there's an element of something that makes sense to you. And so I do that a lot, where I'll make a piece of something and it doesn't work with one piece, and I'll save it for later. So with this piece, this kind of fabric, which was like, I think referencing like the nature in Jamaica and a lot of sorts of visual references from growing up, but and also these kind of breeze block walls in Jamaica. I had put it aside, and then they sort of were sitting next to each other in the studio, and I like brought them closer. So sometimes, it's a funny process of, filtering through your own archive and then making lots of mistakes till you get to the thing that feels right. And I don't know if there's an answer to why it feels right, but
I think
feel like it's like trusting your own voice, and that just comes through spending enough time with your own work, I think, maybe.
I love that, because I think that applies to like whether you're an artist or someone who is not an artist, but to think about this notion of process to exhaustion, to failure, to getting up again, to trying again, to get, and then all of a sudden it's like this magical moment. I mean, I don't want to, it may not always feel that way, but when things make sense.
When I took this picture, it was like in the evening, it was like evening studio lights, and I was just so happy they finally made sense.
Beautiful. It is so beautiful. I want to be conscientious of our time, because we have about, I don't know, a little under 10 minutes before we break off into some questions. But I don't know if you had some other pieces you wanted to share in reference to this current show. I also know another opportunity that I want you to talk about too.
I don't think I have all the pieces from the show on the site, but the show will be up through, I think it was extended through May 2nd at Heaven Gallery in Chicago. And that's in Wicker Park. These are sorts of individual shots of those pieces.
Oh, those are gorgeous.
And this piece is made with all the tiles that I made at Kohler, and then built as this like wall structure. So this is some of the details.
Beautiful.
And this one is called Pro Rata.
Oh yeah, that close-up image. Oh, and this one is, can you talk a little bit about this piece as well?
Yeah, this actually, I built a sort of a slightly larger structure, or wood structure for this piece, for the show it was in. This is also kind of referencing modular architecture. So I spent a lot of time in my father's architecture library as a kid, looking at a lot of like, he had a lot of like Louis Kahn, Corbusier, this Israeli artist Moshe Safdie that did a lot of work that was about sort of using modular architecture, but it was very sort of brutalist, and these big stacking pieces. So the idea that you could kind of create a new city or a new, a new space by just adding, almost like Lego. But then they had this kind of detached quality, like it felt very unfeeling. But I was thinking just about sort of architecture and community with these pieces, and then these smaller pieces, and these were smaller ones that I actually just gave them to Kohler for their collection as part of the residency, and then some of the other works. Yeah.
Fantastic. You mentioned too that you recently received a grant to work with some performers for one of your series, the Dautas. Is that correct? The way I'm
Yeah, daughters. So daughter is a Pata word. So it just means woman. So growing up, like, it's a word it's just a word that's used, like, someone sees you in the street, they'll call you like, hey, daughter. And it's depending on the way it's said, there's different interpretations of it, right? And so I started making these like so long ago in like 2004. So there was sort of the first big sculptural piece I made out of my graduate studies at Pratt. And there are these big deconstructed ball gowns that were sort of looking at the female existence in Jamaica. That's it's complicated. It's a very misogynistic society, but matriarchal at the same time, and sort of ideas of the presentation of the female body, and sort of holding on to sort of some of the colonial customs in terms of dress. And in Jamaica, there is this like long history of what's called pantomime, so theater, music, dance together. And I grew up, you do these songs and dances in school and in Patois in Jamaica, and you wear these costumes, and we'd often have to wear these big skirts, and so it was referencing that, and also thinking through myself as like a woman growing up in Jamaica. And I had always kind of envisioned them moving, or people moving in them. They also reference architecture. So the weave of the pieces, the burlap, it's like two different types of burlap. One's called erosion cloth, and it's like a wide weave that's used for terracing land. And it looks a lot like kind of city grids or architectural structures. And so I started working with different dancers, and I did some experiments. And then I met Jamila Regan in my studio building at Mana, who's a performance artist who's since moved to Brooklyn, but she is a wonderful collaborator. And we did a collaboration. She did, I can play a second.
Yeah, please do.
But she did a performance at Chicago Artists Coalition a couple of years ago.
Wow. It's okay.
Yeah, so the kind of the project using these is the grant will fund a continuation of this. So it's an exploration of Jamaican dance and the history of dance and performance in Jamaica. So there's a couple parts to it. One is research into a cultural historian in Jamaica called Rex Nettlefoot that started the National Dance Theatre of Jamaica in the late 60s. And he was a Rhodes Scholar and kind of cultural historian who's the head of the University of the West Indies for a while. And he was a dancer also. And the National Dance Troupe of Jamaica is still in existence. And it's all volunteer dancers and musicians and costume designers and photographers and set designers. And it's this amazing kind of part of the cultural history of kind of modern Jamaica. And I grew up going to a lot of those dances. And so this will be sort of for me, it's sort of a process of like investigating this part of my history. So, examining the work that he has done. He wrote several books on dancing culture in Jamaica. And then some of it is through Zoom. I'm going to work with some dancers in Jamaica to have these kind of open dance classes on Jamaican dance. And then hopefully work with Jamila and another dancer, Anthony Lovejoy, to kind of further expand the work that they had done, some experiments that they had done with me in Chicago, and then hopefully end in like an in-person performance at some point when that's actually possible. So
that sounds beautiful. And how much do you direct the engagement with the work from a performer's kind of point of view? Do you leave it pretty open? Do you give them some context to work with? Like can you talk a little bit about that process as well?
It's a good question.
It's a hard question, depending.
I feel like it's something I'm still kind of learning, how to kind of navigate and manage. I think, with Jamila, I think we watched a lot of videos together. I kind of showed her sort of the things I was thinking about and influenced by. So there was just a lot of information sharing, and we would like hang out, and I showed her, videos of kind of performances in Jamaica. So there is Rex Nettleford choreographed a dance piece that I have a very like clear visual memory of going to see when I was a kid, that was based around Polkamania, which is kind of a spiritual revivalist sort of sect of Christianity in Jamaica that is kind of a hybrid of Obia, kind of like voodoo, and then Christianity. And within that, there's a lot of ceremony and ritual and dance and kind of chanting and drumming. So I shared that with her, and then we were also looking at like Buto and like dance hall, like modern dance and like contemporary dance hall in Jamaica. And so then I just trusted her to do her thing. Yeah,
I love that. I mean, I think collaboration can be, it is such a always like that. There's always that question, that balance, but I love that you've invited another group of artists to kind of similar to what you even mentioned, which happened by happenstance at the museum in Jamaica, that you had these singers and dancers respond to the work, and you really didn't have any control of that, of what would happen. And in some ways, while you're providing context, both the artwork and some background information, you're allowing and creating a space for someone else to kind of relive or live through that and share in, new meaning of the work or new ways of looking or experiencing it. So I think that's such an interesting approach and quite beautiful.
Yeah, it's an interesting process because I have a tendency to get very like in my own head in my studio. So this is like, in a way, it's also like pushing my own boundaries and like learning through the process of collaboration, which I think is really interesting. And it's sort of, I feel like it brings in new ideas, and like I feel like it pushes the work in different directions. And so that's, I guess, what I hope to get from this process. And also, I grew up around a lot of dance and music, and I really love dancing. I don't know if I'm that great dancer, but I really love dancing. And I just think like, especially in the last year, I took a lot of online dance classes, not a lot, but quite a few with friends. And we've all been so locked in, and it's like this moment of joy and liberation, and like dance, and particularly in Jamaica, is it's like a form of rebellion and kind of a catharsis. Like you can't stop people from dancing, you know? And it's such a kind of form of expression that is its own language, and music too. And so I think it'll be sort of interesting to experience this. And I just hope that like people participate and like gets, something really positive out of it.
Well, I hope that we, we'll all stay in tune for when that happens. I want to ask you one last question, which is a very practical one, but trying to think through and looking and hearing you speak so eloquently about your work, and just seeing how much work you actually have, and that you just had an exhibition, and then also understanding that you will have a full-time job, as you mentioned, in the design world, and a family. How, like, just thinking for people who are wanting to know, like, how does one manage, all of these things at once? I don't know if you have an answer to it, but if you could share like a full-time job, a full-time practice as an artist, and a full-time mother too, you know, what that looks like for you.
Yeah, you know, I mean, it's interesting navigating that because I think for me, my daughters know a little older, you know, your kids are younger. I think there are different needs at different phases in your child's life, you know, and now she wants to spend more time with her friends, which is understandable. She's 15. But I think for a long time, you know, I think my practice was different because I couldn't spend as much time in the studio, and parenting, you know, took up more of my time. And that was important to me, that I had that time with her when she was young. And so I think in a way I sort of feel like I'm like an emerging artist now because she's a little older. So, you know, doing the Kohler residency, I hadn't done a residency since before Bella was born. And then I did the Chicago Artists Coalition Hatch residency. And I think that was really helpful for me, building connections to the community in Chicago. And then I applied to the Kohler residency thinking it was like a total long shot. And then I got to the interview phase and I was like, oh, that's great. I'll say I got to the interview phase. And then I got in and I was like, oh my God, how am I going to do this? And so because it was 2.5 hours from Chicago, and I felt like Bella was old enough that maybe she could handle me being away a couple days a week. And, you know, we did a lot of FaceTime and it wasn't always easy. Sometimes I missed her and I'm sure she missed me, but it was really good for my practice. And I don't know, it's just a hustle. You know, I think it's about kind of carving out the space and time and always making it a priority. And I think when I moved to Chicago, having a larger studio and more space really helped my practice because I had just sort of this physical space that I could make work in. And it's so important to have a space, at least for me, to have a space that feels good to make work in.
Absolutely.
I don't know if I have any answer to it. I mean,
no, I think that's
tired.
Tired. Yes. I think it's just an important question to raise, as we know, you know, talking about being an artist and being a mother, and then of course also working, what we might call a day job is not something that always gets discussed. So I like to bring it into conversation because it's real and it's important, and it's often like something we don't want to talk about. So I want to encourage to have that discussion in these environments.
No, I agree. Sometimes it's sort of uncool. It's like you're not supposed to talk about the other things you have to do.
But they're real. They are real, and they're important for folks to be able to think about.
Yeah.
You know, we only have about 3 minutes left, so I want to end it here, and also then, of course, if there is space or for one question or so, we can open it up. I welcome anyone to ask a question. Let's see. I didn't leave too much time for questions. Thank you. Okay. Well, I have so thoroughly enjoyed speaking with you, Yasmin. I am so moved by your work.
Oh, thank you.
And continue to be, and will continue to follow. And I encourage everyone who is in Chicago to please visit Yasmin's website to spend a little time there and see the work. And then if you can, to go in person to see the show at Heaven Gallery, where you can actually experience the work in person. And I'll tell you, as someone who doesn't get to see work as much in person, like going to these spaces and seeing the work is just like, in this particular moment, just like can bring you to tears. So, and I think Yasmin's work has the power to do that. So that, and also, of course, like, this upcoming performance, I think we need to stay tuned for that too, so that we can all take dance class.
Yeah, I hope everybody shows up to shake their booty. I know. Yeah, no, I totally hear you on like missing seeing work. I think, you know, there's something about you were talking about this last night in your talk also, but like the physical experience of being in front of something is so different. Yes. I mean, it's wonderful that we have this virtual platform to get us through this time, but there isn't anything like being in front of a piece of artwork and kind of getting lost in it, you know.
It's so true. Thank you so much, Yasmin.
A
Thank you.
massive thank you to the two of you for this incredibly rich discussion. I know we have a couple of things in the chat also reiterating that. So once again, thank you all so, so much. And thank you everyone who's joined us tonight for Curator Conversations. Feel free to stay in touch with both Cortney and Yasmin, and of course with 21C as well. If you'd like to come see our current exhibition, This We Believe, we are open and you're welcome to book reservations through our website, which I just popped into the chat. But with that, thank you all so much again and for tuning in tonight.
Thank you
Have a
both.
good rest
Thank
of
you,
your
Adina.
evening.
Thank you, Cortney, and thank you everybody that showed up.
That's right. Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone.
Bye. Good night all.
Bye.